Beneath the normal internet we all know, like YouTube, Facebook and Google, there lies the dark web, an anonymous and regulated world, with websites not accessible from search engines, a hidden corner of the internet where anything goes. For a while, the biggest site on the dark web was Silk Road, an online black market for all kinds of illegal goods and services, ranging from body parts to weapons to hitmen, and most commonly of all, drugs. In fact, Silk Road was dubbed the Amazon of drugs, because you could simply go to the Silk Road site, buy any substance you wanted with just a few clicks, and have it shipped to your doorstep like an Amazon package. But what's perhaps most surprising of all about this is who is behind this illegal empire. Meet Ross Ulbricht, our story's surprising protagonist. Ross grew up in a loving family in Texas. He was a Boy Scout as a kid, studied physics at university, and was thought of as a very sweet guy by all his friends and family. So imagine their shock when they realized Ross was the criminal mastermind behind the largest online drug empire in history, responsible for over $1.2 billion worth of sales of illegal goods and services. Not just that, but this sweet kid who reportedly paid hitmen to kill his enemies, or did he? To this day, there is debate over whether Ross is guilty or not. So in this video, we're gonna dive into the murky world of the dark web and explore the true story behind the infamous Silk Road marketplace. We're also gonna look at how the government really managed to track down Ross, despite the fact that Ross was using the Tor browser, which made him completely anonymous. How do you find someone who can't be trapped? This is a true story filled with mysteries, twists, and even a couple of corrupt government agents. Welcome to the fascinating story of the Silk Road Empire. So, Ross Ulbricht wanted to change the world, but his life so far had been a series of almost. He tried several business ideas, but never quite got anywhere with them, and he was starting to feel like his life was passing him by. However, there was one business idea Ross kept coming back to: an online marketplace where people could buy or sell anything imaginable with no limits or restrictions. You see, Ross was a staunch libertarian and would regularly debate with people about why the government shouldn't have so much control over people's lives, especially when it came to drugs, which he felt should all be legalized. He'd say it's not the government's right to tell people what they can or can't put in their bodies. And whenever someone tried to argue about safety concerns, Ross would say, well, should we outlaw Big Macs from McDonald's too? Because they make people gain weight and have heart attacks and die. What about cars? They kill millions every year. And so to Ross, the idea of a marketplace where people could buy and sell whatever they wanted was not just a business to potentially make a lot of money. In his view, it was also a way to free people and help the world. After some research, Ross discovered there was a web browser called Tor, which allowed you to access the dark web where you couldn't be tracked or traced. The Tor browser was actually developed by this Navy as a way to communicate privately over the internet by concealing a user's real IP address and identity. By using this, Ross realized people would be able to buy things online without the government being able to see what they were doing. But at first, Ross didn't go any further with the idea because there was no way to accept payments online promoting the site. When it first Gary said that the user had slipped up, and on one of his later posts included his personal email, Ross Ulbricht @gmail.com. Gary then went on to explain but couldn't easily be traced on Stack Overflow. A user had posted a code in question related to Tor under the name Ross Ulbricht, but then a minute later changed the name to the pseudonym Frost at that exact moment. For example, one of the other agents on the call cut Gary off and said, "Wait, did you just say Frosty?" Gary was a little frustrated. He still had more to explain. "Yes," I said, "Frosty. But why are you focusing on that? Credit cards would keep a log of every transaction. When we got the server from Iceland, we found that both the server and the computer that belongs to DPR had both been given the same name, Frosty." Someone made. There was a brief silence. The dot was starting to connect. Gary then added that he tracked where Ross was currently living. However, when Gary on his record shared Ross's current address, they couldn't believe it. Ross was living in San Francisco, just a couple of blocks and be linked to their bank accounts, where they tracked the Silk Road admin. This was clearly their guy. The truth was now clear to everyone on the call. The D agents. And Gary from
Ross
Dowrez.
Albrecht
Gary
was
had been
Dread
right.
Pirate
The elusive
Roberts.
criminal mastermind they'd
For
been
the last
chasing.
couple of years perhaps.
So for a little while. Wasn't quite the criminal
He'd made
mastermind
several.
they'd thought. Major mistakes that exposed his true
His
identity.
downfall was simply
This was a
because
guy
of
in his
human error.
20s who'd never expected
And thus
Silk
hadn't
Road
taken
to
or as
become
Gary
what
would
it did.
say,
His tracks.
This was the
A
digital
minor detail
equivalent
that
of the
had been
parking
overlooked.
ticket. Side remained just an idea, and
Either
Ross's
way, the
mind.
authorities finally knew
That Ross Albrecht was
now
the
they
one
just had
behind
to catch
Silk
him.
Road.
But surprisingly, that wasn't going to be as easy as you
The
think.
FBI
To
assigned
track
a team
Ross
of undercover
and
agents
watch his every move
because they had access
now
to
they
the
could
Silk
literally
Road server logs.
until the summer of 2010. See when the Silk Road admin
And it
logged
always
in or out.
coincided
with when
It
Ross
was
opened or
undeniable.
closed his laptop.
He was their guy. So why weren't
To
they
arrest
rushing
him.
in immediately?
Well, you see, they needed to catch
That
him with his
laptop
laptop
contained
open.
when
all
Ross
kinds
came
of
across a
valuable
new
data.
technology,
That would
but
not
also
only
in
help
tracking
worked
down
on Silk
other
Road
bros.
or big dealers,
But if a
on
team
the
of
site
agents
just suddenly swarmed,
he would
into
likely
arrest
have
Ross,
time to close his
which
laptop
would lock
lid.
it, and mean all the data
And
was
near
encrypted
impossible
to
to
break
Bitcoin.
into.
Plus, if they didn't catch Ross literally
Sitting at his laptop, it would give him some kind of deniability.
So they
had to catch him red-handed, with the laptop open in front of him, so they could definitely prove
When
he
Ross
was
woke up
responsible.
on October
2013,
it seemed just like
he
any other
initially
day.
went to a nearby
A digital
cafe,
currency.
but it was quite busy,
And he couldn't get a
that was
spot to work
private
in.
enough. So instead, he went to sit in the
Public
San
library.
Francisco. He found a secluded spot where nobody could see
And
his
logged
screen.
into the Silk Road admin
area, of course.
Ross was completely
Which could be
unaware.
transferred
The library
who were
was
watching
filled
him.
with
But
undercover
remember,
FBI
one wrong
agents.
move
and
from
Ross
the
could
authorities,
panic and close
thus
the laptop.
encrypting all the data.
They couldn't let
Or it would
Ross
all
know
be
they
over.
were
So
onto
to
him.
undercover agents created
Right
a
behind
distraction,
Ross,
thus allowing
posing
people
as
to
a
buy
couple
whatever
one of them
they
swore
wanted,
loudly in the quiet
causing
library.
Ross to
At
turn
that
around
exact
to see
moment
what
Ross
was
turned
going
around.
on. Another agent who'd been positioned right
Swooped in
next
and
in front of
grabbed
Ross
Ross'
tried to
laptop
reach out to
without a
grab it,
trace.
but it was too late.
Another agent had come
Placing
up
him
behind
under
him. It was
and
all
handcuffed
perfectly
him.
timed. So Ross had no chance to react.
Ross had been caught,
Logged into the admin section,
and in the
so
corner
the
of
name
the
from
computer,
and not just that. It was exactly what
on
he
his
needed.
unlocked
Was a
computer,
full diary
along
about
with
running
thousands of
Silk
chat
Road.
messages
He sent whilst running
all
the
of
sites,
which could be used as evidence to
and
convict
verify
him.
this
Newspaper
story. And
stations
TV,
all around the
the
world
Boy Scout
covered the
who'd
story.
been secretly
So from
running
his
the
website
website
to
$2
$1
billion
billion
of
of
drugs,
weapons, poisons, and other illegal
his family
goods,
was
or
sure
there'd
he'd
been a
been
mistake.
framed.
This couldn't possibly be
Ross
there.
could it.
Sometimes.
When I'm researching these business
Ross
stories,
began
they feel
working
more
than
like
real
the plot
life,
of a
but they
Hollywood
do
play.
say that the truth is
And
often
this next
stranger
part
than
is
fiction.
so
So after
absolutely
the authorities
ridiculous.
got
They
hold
could
of
see
Ross's
everything.
open laptop,
including all his chat
but
histories.
this led the FBI to realize
There was a government agent.
he decided to call
Who'd
it
been
Silk
working
Road,
on the
who
Silk
had been
World
privately
case.
messaging Ross. And accepting secret payments from him in exchange for information
This
about
corrupt
the
agent
case.
was Carl Force,
And he obviously thought, because the messages were encrypted and the payment was in Bitcoin, he would never get caught. But now the government had Ross's chat histories, named after a famous trade route that had started over, and records of the Bitcoin transactions.
It all started when Carl initially
as a
posed
big-time drug
under the
smuggler
username
on the
Knob.
Silk Road forums. He began messaging Ross, or as he knew him back then, Dread Pirate Roberts, and started to build a relationship with him. Once Carl had built up some
He
trust
told him
with
that
Ross,
he knew of a mole within the
2,000
D.
years ago, and started selling information about the Silk Road case
Of
to
course,
Ross.
Carl himself was the mole.
He was taking payments from Ross
In exchange for information about the
over
case.
the course of several months. Carl received over $750,000 in Bitcoin
in exchange for sending
about the
information
Silk
to
Road
Ross
case that people use
But
for
things
centuries.
get much
You
crazier.
see, one of the employees Ross had hired to help
was
him
a guy
with Silk
called
Road,
Curtis Green.
who had become a site moderator. But one day, when Curtis got a large
Sent to
shipment
his
of
house,
coke, he was caught by the Baltimore task
and
force
got arrested.
to carry all kinds of different goods.
Ross was obviously
why
confused
his moderator suddenly stopped
because at
replying
first
to him. He had no idea Curtis had
And
been
then he
arrested.
noticed
Curtis had stolen $350,000
because
from
as
Silk
a
Road. Curtis
moderator
had access to some of the site's funds
that were being held in
understandably.
Now Ross obviously
That he'd
assumed
stolen
Curtis
money
had
from
been
the
and then
site.
vanished.
But in yet another twist, it wasn't Curtis who stole
It was
the
another
money from the
corrupt
site.
agent.
On the Baltimore
After
task
arresting
force
Curtis
called
Green,
Sean Bridges, Sean had logged into Curtis's Silk Road
that had
account.
moderated privileges.
Ross was very wary and started transferring some
his
of the
own
Silk
personal
Road
accounts.
Bitcoins. So this government agent was basically siphoning
to his
money
own
off
personal
Silk Road
Bitcoin wallet.
whilst logged in with Cody's
And just to be
moderator
clear,
accounts. Sean wasn't doing this to turn the money
to the
over.
governments. He was moving the funds to his own personal,
Of anyone knowing about the site he was building,
private accounts, thinking he wouldn't get caught.
because it was in Bitcoin. So just to recap, we now have two different corrupt agents working on the Silk
Who are
Road
both
case,
part
of the Baltimore
both
task
with their
force. Separate schemes to steal Bitcoin
As for Ross,
themselves, which unfortunately, he obviously had no idea about any
he
of
just
this.
assumed Curtis had robbed him.
So according to the chat logs from Ross's computer, he decided to hire someone to go after Curtis.
Initially, Ross didn't want to kill him. He just wanted his money back.
And maybe to beat him up a bit.
Ross
Ross is in a circle that he spoke to on Silk
like
Road.
Variety. Jones persuaded Ross it was the right
Meant
decision.
he had to build it all by himself.
to have Curtis killed because he needed to send a message that he couldn't be crossed.
Otherwise, other Silk
Might think
Road
about
employees
betraying Ross.
Ross
in the
had to
future
send
as
a
well.
message.
Ultimately, Ross agreed
And asked if anyone could kill Curtis. One of the people who saw that request
the
was
other
Carl
corrupt
Force,
agent, the only person he told at first,
who was part of the same
sensing
team
an
who
opportunity
just arrested Curtis.
to make yet more money for
Carl
himself.
replied,
Using his knob username,
and said he knew some
he
pros who
said
could
they
get
need
the job
40K
done,
up
and
front.
40K after.
The execution was complete.
So Ross sent the first half
Was
of the
his
payment.
girlfriend Julia,
Carl then got Curtis,
who he had under arrest.
and staged his death.
They took a photo of what looked like
Except
Curtis's
Curtis wasn't
dead body.
dead.
It was just a stage photo.
But Ross didn't know that.
He assumed the hit had been carried out successfully
And
and paid the rest of the money to Carl.
Now his girlfriend was a little concerned.
Ross
did right back that
by
he
the
was
photo
a little disturbed.
and explained,
I'm new to this kind of thing.
it was clear.
He was quite distressed
But as
about
far as
issuing
Ross
a hit
knew,
on someone.
Curtis had stolen
Hundreds of thousands of dollars from him.
so he rationalized that having him killed
But Ross reassured her that
was necessary. In reality, of course, Curtis was alive, and it was the corrupt agent Sean
who stolen the money from Curtis's moderator
and the other
account,
corrupt
who had
agent
faked
Carl,
Goods' death
in order to make even more
from
money
a supposed hit job.
shortly after this.
Thanks to the tour, Ross would end up ordering hits on 5 other people,
including a
crossed him,
hacker.
who was trying to extort money from him.
As far as Ross was concerned,
He now had the power to pay to get anyone
if he needed
killed.
to,
In the diary on Ross's computer,
send
he
payment
wrote,
to angels
for hit on Tony76 web browser
and his 3 associates,
which was then followed by an update about some work he'd done on the site that day.
It seemed like
had now
ordering
just
a
become
hit
a
on
fairly
someone.
normal part of the job to Ross. But again, just like with the hit he
None of
ordered
these
on
murders
Curtis Ross paid for
ever took place.
No bodies were ever found.
And Bitcoin. It seems Ross was simply getting scammed
By other people,
claiming to be hitmen,
and nobody had actually
which was
been
lucky for
killed.
Ross, because when he eventually
Got caught in the library, and all these
The murder
messages
for-
he'd sent were discovered. Higher charges against him
it would all be completely anonymous,
were dropped
because even though they had evidence
from his chat logs
that he paid
for those hits
and that he believed the orders had been carried out, it was all an elaborate scam and he couldn't be convicted of
when
murder.
nobody had been murdered. So nothing could be traced back to him. Now, for legal reasons, I should stress that Ross's family still maintains that someone planted those messages
on his computer,
and that Ross never wrote
as
them
for Carl
himself.
and Sean,
the 2 corrupt agents,
as for making the site itself,
both were sentenced to -1 years in prison.
It's seriously
each. Crazy that 2 separate government agents working on the same case both tried to steal so much money and secretly transfer
and
it
if
to
Ross
their own
hadn't been
Bitcoin
caught,
wallets.
it was slow work to figure everything out.
They likely wouldn't have been caught either.
But of course,
Ross was caught.
and now it's time
We look at the final and most crucial part of all of this. What actually happened to Ross?
Okay, it's time for a very quick break.
As building an entire online marketplace by
While I
itself.
ask you a favor, if you're enjoying this video so far,
Please turn on the
I'm
notification
posting
bell
many
for
movies
magnates
about
media,
business, money,
marketing, and more.
but just subscribing
Doesn't always mean you'll see them. So please consider turning
and I'll
on
love you forever.
notifications. Ross was being charged with
was a
7
massive
different
job,
offenses, including drug trafficking, money laundering, and the kingpin statutes, something which was normally reserved for cartel leaders. However, even though Ross had been caught with his fingers on the laptop whilst logged in as the admin on Silk Road, he still pled not guilty. His lawyers admitted that Ross had started, but Ross was determined, the Silk Road, but claimed he had done so as
not
a social
as a
experiment. They then
to make
said, money. Shortly after he started the site, things had begun to get a little out of control, and thus Ross had decided to sell
someone
the site,
else
who went by the name Dread Pirate Roberts. They claimed that after that, and he worked very long hours to
Ross
make it
had
a
no
reality,
further
involvement in the
and
site,
that Ross was
as
simply
the full
being
guy
set
by
up.
the real DPR. They argued the chat logs and diary
had been
on
planted
Ross's computer, there to try and pin all the blame on him. However, unfortunately,
The evidence
for
against
Ross,
him
he
was
had literally
overwhelming
sat
and
at his
caught.
laptop, logged into the Silk Road admin page, loaded on his laptop whilst at
Not
the
just
library. The chat logs on his computer
And showed
dated
everything
back
he'd
multiple
said,
years, including the conversation with Variety
where they
Jones,
invented
the Dread Pirate Roberts
as
name
an alibi
if he was ever caught. Messages also showed
coding
DPR
all day,
telling someone he was buying fake IDs because he needed to expand Silk Road
and these
server
messages
space.
were
Ross's
sent
fake
right at the
IDs
same
were
time.
intercepted. As for the notion that Ross sold
there
the
was
sites,
absolutely no
plus
recorded
Ross had
indication
still
of that
been from site
receiving all the
commissions,
Bitcoin.
so it seemed clear he was still the one who'd been running it, and most of the nights, all this time, from start to finish, Ross had been Dread Pirate Roberts. Despite this, advocates came from all over to support Ross during the trial, but many of them protesting on the steps
of the courthouse that he was a hero.
They said that all Ross had
And
done
if that
was
was
run
a
a
crime,
website. He would just occasionally take a break.
Then
The CEOs of eBay and Craigslist should stand
as
trial
illegal
too.
goods were sold on those
The jury
websites
did not
as
see it
well.
the same way. They returned their verdict guilty on all counts. The chat logs and files
were
on
just too
Ross's
damning.
computer. If he'd only closed the laptop lid when in the
It's
library
likely
to watch one of his favorite shows, they wouldn't have been able to prove
Before
so
his
much.
sentencing,
Ross sent a letter to the judge.
I've had
which
my
said,
youth,
and I know you must take away my middle
but
years.
please leave me with my
Please
old
leave a
age.
small light at the end of the tunnel.
An excuse to stay healthy.
An excuse to dream of better days ahead. And a chance to redeem myself
Breaking
in the
Bad.
free world before I meet my maker. The judge did not listen
Ross
to this.
received
To life sentences, plus 40 years, with no parole. In other words, Ross would spend the entire rest of his life. Some felt this was overly harsh, but it seemed the judge wanted the story of a normal guy, of him to try and deter other
setting
people.
up similar
The judge also
marketplaces
explained
in
her
future
decision by saying that she disagreed
drug
with
use
Ross's
only
philosophy.
affects
She
those
said
who
there
take
were
the
many
drug.
other
Because of the
people
dangerous
told on Shell
substances.
Grove. People die and lose loved ones. Families get ripped apart. Who becomes a drug kingpin? Junkies are created, and in many instances, ADD excludes their ability to care for their children, and a generation can grow
And
up
orphaned.
neglected. In other words, Silk Road caused irreparable
To many
harm.
people.
The judge also pointed out that, however, as Ross was finally, whilst no bodies had been found, Ross had commissioned 5 murders,
Which he paid for,
and he fully believed they'd taken place. Ultimately, the evidence against
And thus
Ross
seemed
was
conclusive.
sentenced to life in jail. Of course, there's two sides to
On
this.
the
one hand, there have been studies nearing completion
that
of the
showed
Silk
people
Road
were
site
much
to be
less
physically
likely
harmed buying these substances online compared to on the streets. And Ross tried to argue Silk Road actually made the experience much safer, especially with the review
on the
system.
sides.
If these people were gonna buy
He
illegal
realized
goods
he
anyway,
had a problem.
Silk Road was probably
Ross
a much
was
safer
also
way to do
technically
it. A first-time offender, and this was a non-violent
so the
charge.
life
sentencing did seem unusually extreme, because yes, Ross built the Silk Road, but aside from the initial shrooms he needed some
grew.
product. He wasn't selling any drugs himself. He was a web admin, and you could argue that drug trades happen all the time on platforms
But that
like
doesn't
Facebook
mean the
and
platform
Snapchat is to
creator.
blame. On the other hand, there is clearly to actually sell on his new marketplace a big difference between Silk Road and those other sites. Those other sites don't allow illegal sales, whereas Silk Road actively encouraged it and made it possible. Plus in 2015,
a study from the Centers
it was no use building the platform
for Disease
Control and Prevention
said
that for the first time in recent history. More people had died from opioid-related overdoses in America than from gun deaths. They found one of the main reasons for the rising
was
deaths
due to these in which
people could now gain
access to these substances.
When people first came, the growth in substance abuse coincided with the growth in popularity of Silk Roads. In other words, people got access to items they likely wouldn't have been able to access without Silk Road. There was nothing to buy. And in multiple cases, that led to people dying. Silk Road made it easy
for people of
all ages to
unsafe
access
substances
and illegal goods. And Ross
that,
enabled.
in fact,
He personally. So Ross rented out a building
approved
in
the
the middle
sale
of nowhere of countless extremely dangerous items. However, no matter what side of the debate you
have
fall
to
on, recognize it's not fully black and white. What does seem clear is that Ross and began growing his own magic
was the
mushrooms
creator
and operator of Celtic Road, and that from February 6, 2011 to July 23, 2013, it estimated well over 1.2 million using a book unique transactions happened on the site, and 9,519,664 Bitcoin was generated. In sales of that 600, that was essentially, and 14,305 Bitcoin was taken by Rhoda's commission. Some of that money was reinvested back into side growth staff and maintenance, a dummy's guide. And some of it Ross took for himself back in 2013. When Ross was caught, that money was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. As of today, it would be worth tens of billions of dollars. It's ironic, really, to building your own mushroom farm, that Ross was a big fan of the show Breaking Bad, as there's clearly parallels with his own story, a seemingly total normal guy who descends into becoming a drug kingpin, gradually getting more. This would be the first product extreme along the way, like ordering a hit to get someone killed, and likewise, both started out with a more noble objective. For Walt, it was to pay his medical bills. For Ross, it was to give people freedom to ever be sold on the Silk Road. But both seemed to end up lacking the power and wealth they gained a little too much, and they got carried away and pushed things too far until finally it all caught up with them. Even though the judge had expected that the sentencing she gave by early Ross 2011 would deter anyone else from in reality, almost
Silk
immediately
Road site
after
got
the
shut
original
down.
Silk Road 2.0 popped up. Arguably, all the attention of the Silk Road
just got
case.
more people
However,
interested
sequels are
in the
rarely
idea.
better
And
than
indeed,
the
the
haven't quite
multiple
gained the
Silk
same as
Road
Ross's
sequels.
original. After a year of work on the site, Silk Road lasted exactly 1 year before federal agents hosting found the Silk
server
Road to in a foreign country and realized the server was registered to the
Blake
mail
at Bentel
address.
Net.
Turns out a guy called Blake Bentel, who was allegedly operating the site, had used his own personal
was ready
email
to
account
launch it to the world
with his full name
to
in set up the server for Silk Road. So just like Ross's use of his
led the
personal
FBI
mail
to him.
address, the same happened with
I'm
Blake.
still
not sure why you would possibly
personal
use your
email
real
address
Anyway,
for
once
that.
again, there was some controversy
able
around
to
how the
locate this
authorities
server
in the first
He'd
place.
added categories.
Some think governments used a potentially illegal spying technique, and others think the Tor network
may be
itself.
compromised.
There's all kinds
But
of
none
theories.
of that has stopped
Dark
countless
marketplaces
other
popping
similar
up
over
generally
the last
as
few
one
years.
shuts down. Another one tends to open, although quite often for all different types of drugs. It turns out the entire site was a scam, or even a honeypot by the government to catch dealers. Many of the people who set up
similar
these Silk
illegal
Road
marketplaces
do so under the name Dread Pirate
So in a way,
Roberts. Ross's vision
and be
of a
passed
free
down
market
from
that
person
would
to
live on
person.
to begin with did kind of happen, although since Ross is facing the rest of his life in prison. Now if you found this story
I think
of
you're
Silk
really
about
gonna
Mark
enjoy this
Zuckerberg's
video I
Bitcoin
made.
billionaires. This video looks
Including
at the
its
rise
title
of the
only
Silk
item
Road,
listed.
and you can
To
click
watch
here
the
right
insane
now. Full story for
Finally,
yourself.
I just want to say
Thank you for watching this video.
you are a
end.
legend.
And I'll see you
Was
in
the
the next one.
mushrooms he'd
Cheers.
grown himself.
But the plan was that sellers
Would list
from
their
all
own
over the
items
world
for sale.
Of course, in order
And
to
sellers
attract
to the
both, he needed
buyers.
to promote it.
Remember, sites on the dark web
Are not picked up by search
and
engines.
it's also
not like Ross could
Facebook
just run
or
to
Google
help find
ads
customers
for his illegal marketplace.
So to get a word out
Ross
about his
went
new
on
site,
to spread the
several
word.
internet
For
forums.
example,
He joined a site called
for fans
The
of
Shroomer
shrooms
and made a post
pretending to be a customer.
interested.
The
in
reason
using
he did
was
this
so it didn't seem like
promoting
he was
his own websites.
He knew that
By casual
name dropping
people
Silk
on the
Road
forums
would go and check
they
it out
did.
for
Orders
themselves.
soon started
Now
coming.
this was all
2011
happening at the beginning,
and
of.
at the same time,
Ross was working
called
at a little
Good
this
wagon
worked out
because
really
it meant
well.
to
Ross
easily
had
ship out
everything
his because he
shrooms.
was able to
Envelopes
use them.
and
He also
envelopes
used a
padded
vacuum
that
sealer
normally
would keep food fresh.
to wrap the mushrooms up.
So Ross
And
was
was
shipping
initially
off orders twice a week.
But as the site's popularity
Grew through word of mouth.
Ross soon had to
Out
start
every
mailing
day
shipments.
as more
But
and more
even better
orders
than
other
that,
coming
people
in
had started
selling items on Silk Road.
Other dealers had created their own list.
things with
to cope
everything
to
and
and
of course
more products for sale.
helped attract
And
even
Silk
more
Road
buyers.
initially took a
3% commission
on every single trade.
in order to make
Feel
people
more comfortable
using the sites.
Ross also built a
Rating system where buyers
and sellers
could review each
similar
other
to eBay's
or Amazon
feedback
reviews
system. Ross worked tirelessly
on the site and was constantly exhausted.
but he was also
by its
incredibly
growth.
excited.
When he first made the site,
He honestly
hadn't been sure
if anyone would use it at
all, and yet
in just a couple of months
he'd already made
thousands of dollars.
He told his
in revenue.
girlfriend
about the
Julia,
progress
although
of
she
the sites
was slightly
less excited
Julia was
by
concerned
the fact harder drugs
were now being
sold on Silk Road,
especially when she
someone had
realized
even
started selling heroin on there. Her doubts about
started
the whole
to grow.
and she asked Ross,
What if someone overdoses
or sell her,
send out stuff
that's been tampered with or laced with
something else?
Ross confidently
her of the rating
reminded.
system. He said if someone sells
They'd get a bad
drugs,
rating.
and no one will buy
Julia
from them,
simply
but how are
said,
they
yeah,
supposed
to give a bad
if they're
rating?
dead? While Silk Road
Through word
had
of
been
mouth.
growing fairly quickly, growth started to get crazy. Once Gawker wrote an article about the
Right
sites.
after that,
Many
article
other
went
news
live,
sites started writing
as well,
about Silk
describing
Road
it as an underground website
that lets you buy any
even
drug
big TV
imaginable.
news networks like
Began
ABC
talking
and
about
NBC,
the
thus
site.
bringing it even more attention.
Thousands of drugs came through the black website called Silk Road. Of course, not all that attention was
Multiple
good. Different government agencies were now watching the site
and beginning to investigate
but because of
who
the
was
use
running
of
it.
Tor, they knew tracking whoever was behind it would be extremely difficult. Meanwhile, Ross started working on Silk Road.
He had no
full-time.
choice, really.
It was going so much quicker than he ever expected.
The site now had
and
hundreds
thousands
of
of
sellers.
buyers. And whilst Ross had sold all the mushrooms,
He was
grown
now making commissions
from
on
the
every
sites.
sale.
As more money rolled in, it was exhilarating. But one morning, he opened his laptop and noticed someone had now listed guns
Ross
on
tried
there.
to rationalize that
It was an American's constitutional
So
right
this
to
wasn't
have a
a
gun.
problem.
However, once again, his girlfriend Julia saw it differently. Ross, you have to stop this, she pleaded. Think about why someone would need to
Anonymously.
buy a gun. Ross and Julia argued
And
about
Julie
this.
went off
to her friend Erica's house.
Julia
Julia had become paranoid
increasingly,
about everything,
and so
Ross
she
was
confided
doing
in her friend
about
Erica.
Ross running.
She made
Silk Road
Erica
that she'd never
promise.
say a word about it to anyone, and for a while, it seemed like she'd kept that promise. However, one morning, Ross logged onto Facebook and saw a public post on his wall from Julia's best friend
I'm
Erica
sure the
saying,
authorities
would like to know about Ross Ulbricht's
Immediately,
drug website. Panic filled his body, and
a
he
wave
broke down
of
in
emotions
tears.
crashed over
Firstly,
him.
he was angry Julia
that
had
he
told
was
someone
running
else.
the sites.
Secondly, he felt heartbroken that she would betray his trust like that.
But
mostly the strongest emotion
he immediately
felt was
deleted
fear. Erica's post off his Facebook
and
wall,
phoned her in tears,
begging her never to mention it to anyone
as
again.
for why Erica had made the post.
Calling out Ross,
It
in
had
the
all
first
started
place
when
from
Erica
a
had
substance
a bad
she
trip
bought when
off
she
Silk
got
Road.
back from the hospital. She'd got into a fight with
which
both
had ended
Julia
with
and
Ross
Erica
causing
in
Erica
an
to
intoxicated
leave.
state. Had then
State.
posted on Facebook.
Luckily
revenge.
for Ross,
he'd seen the post quickly enough, meaning the post was deleted before hardly anyone saw it, and it was only their
Who would have
Facebook
been able
friends
to see it anyway?
who probably assumed it was just a joke. So the crisis seemed to have been
But this
averted for
incident
now.
made
Ross extremely
Julia
anxious.
and Ross's relationship
As Julia
also
refused to
ended.
let Ross keep running the site from her apartments, she issued him with an ultimatum that he had to close the site down or leave.
He chose to leave.
In fact, after the Eric
Ross
incident,
decided
just
he
as a
needed to
precaution, and so he
temporarily
went
leave the
traveling.
country.
Ross went to Bondi Beach in Australia.
He went to
relax.
Vietnam
to celebrate the Lunar New Year. He even backpacked through Asia from different islands and staying in youth hostels. Of course, the travelers he met along the way had absolutely no clue Ross was running the biggest illegal site in the world. Millions of dollars in Bitcoin. Life was good for Ross. The only downside of traveling was that Ross often had to rely on internet cafes so he could run the site. And he was understandably anxious about people seeing his screen and realizing what he was doing. Thus, he always had to pick the internet in the corner. And he also programmed his laptop so that he could immediately turn his screen just in black. Case. It felt like anyone was looking at what he was doing, because he was technically a wanted man all around the world. Since Silk Road was a global and the thought site of ending up in a prison in Southeast Asia, where people had been known to get hanged for selling drugs, was particularly scary. The site's rapid growth also presented other problems. Trying to build an entire marketplace by himself had meant the code was filled with bugs. One particularly bad coding when someone purchased something on Silk Road, Ross lost money on the transaction. Instead of gaining money, Ross had no choice but to temporarily block new signups on Silk Road while he desperately tried to fix the issue. Frost was now working round the clock on the site, trying to manage all these new issues that kept popping up, who demanded ransoms in Bitcoin, complaints from customers, and packages that had been seized in the mail. As word about the site continued to grow, Ross realized that, just like any other growing business, he needed employees to help him. So he started recruiting internally by hiring active users of Silk Road to help him manage everything. Soon he had 10 employees, some rewriting his shoddy code, some moderating the Silk Road forums, and others dealing with support issues and disputes. Paying these staff, most of them viewed it as more than a job because they all had similar and political views. They felt they were building something big here, and that Silk Road was gonna change. Meanwhile, many other product also started popping up on the sites. For example, some sellers started offering spy software and tools to hack into people's webcams. You could also buy passports and fake or IDs, even counterfeit cash, but look just like the real thing. And in one case, someone had even listed a rocket launcher, and another was trying to sell well-known poison. Then one day, Ross woke up to a message saying, "Should we let people sell kidneys?" Turns out one human body parts Road wanted to sell various. The seller added that they'd all been acquired. Ross was obviously a little concerned. This wasn't quite what he'd envisioned when he initially started the sites, but the way he saw it, Silk Road was merely a platform. Just like Facebook or eBay, it was the users who chose how to use it. It was against his philosophy what to tell they could individuals buy and sell. He wanted a free market, so he didn't interfere. And as a result, the wide variety of illegal products for sale on Silk Road continued to attract even more attention to the sites. What's interesting, though, is Silk Road actually became a bit of many viewed it not just as a marketplace, but a movement. On the community forum, Ross even introduced a Silk Road where once a week, many Silk Road users would all start watching at the same time. Movie. Ross's first film choice was V for Vendetta, and the movie's anti-government theme was definitely popular. Silk Road also started running to help some where people could win various illegal substances. However, there was where the competition winner ended up disappearing right after winning, and some presumed he'd overdosed on the prize. Ross joked that perhaps a better competition prize would have been rehab. Oh, there was a particularly active user who went by the name Variety Jones, and he started helping Ross find bugs and create a plan to help. The two of them started chatting every single day message and became close friends, but in a bizarre way. He was kind of like a business coach to Ross, whoever Variety Jones was. He clearly had a lot of experience with the drug business. One day, Variety Jones messaged Ross, not to be a downer or anything, but what we're doing falls under laws, which provides a maximum penalty of death. The mandatory minimum is life. Ross was very well aware of this, although he generally tried not to think about it. Said he had the two of them were both fans of the movie, The Princess Bride, and in that film, there's a feared pirate called Dread Pirate Roberts. The name was passed down from person to person over the years. Variety Jones said Ross should change his name to Dread Pirate Roberts instead of just the username admin, which Ross had previously been using. Ross loved the idea because this way, if Ross ever got caught or connected, or the blame couldn't be pinned on him, Ross could admit he'd once been, but he could say that just like in the movie. It was a title that was passed down, and he personally was no longer claim someone else Dread Pirate taken Roberts over from that moment forward. Ross went by Dread Pirate Roberts, or DPR for shorts, and him and Variety Jones continued to chat. They'd even sign off each with messages like, "Sweet dreams, Captain,"
Before connecting with
Ross
Variety
had been
Jones,
feeling incredibly lonely,
since obviously he couldn't tell anyone else what he was doing,
especially not after
and
what
Julia
happened with
instance.
the Erica. Ross had to lie to all
and
his
friends
family
about his life.
In fact, he told them he was
So
a
they
day
assumed
trader
he was just on
because
his
he was
laptop
trading
so
stocks.
much.
But now having this digital friendship
Jones
with
helped him
Variety,
feel less
he
alone.
now had a literal partner.
Of
in
course,
crime.
it wasn't all perfect.
As the site continued to grow in
There
popularity,
were multiple incidents where
managed
hackers
to steal Bitcoin from
because
Ross,
of issues with the site, or they would attack the
and
site,
Ross would have to pay
and
them a
Bitcoin to
ransom.
stop.
Luckily, Ross was making so much
That the
money
hackers
by this
getting
point
didn't
some Bitcoin
actually
from
matter
him.
that much. It was just a normal day at the office.
Ross had never
By the time
believed
the site
was
it was
a year old.
estimated to
Half
be
a
getting
million
at
dollars
least,
worth
which
of
meant a
sales
lot
per
of
week.
commission
The
for
price
Ross.
of Bitcoin
So all the
was
money
rapidly
Russ was
from the
making
site's transaction
were suddenly
fees.
worth a lot more.
By the end of Silk Road's second year,
It reached almost 1 million users,
and Ross's personal
was
net
reportedly
worth,
tens
most
of
which
millions
was
of
Bitcoin.
dollars.
Stood on some drives
But Ross
scattered
told
around
Variety
by the
Jones
time
he
was
wanted
30,
to be worth
and
$1
incredible.
billion.
It looked like it could actually
They just
be
had to
possible.
keep expanding.
Within 2 years of launching,
Silk Road was at nearly
by
a
its
million
peak,
users.
if Silk Road was
it
a
would be
normal
called
company,
a label
unicorn,
given to businesses.
valued at over
it
$1
was
billion.
unbelievable,
A guy in his
really.
20s,
Running the world's largest
from his
illegal
laptop.
empire.
Ross had a slight
Whilst
surreal
visiting the
moment
country
of Dominica,
where he realized Silk
was
Road
worth more
but
than the entire
occasionally
country's GDP.
Ross would get
that
a
the
brutal
empire he
reminder
was building
did have some very real-life consequences.
Like when he saw this on the news.
The synthetic LSD that killed the
was
president
brought online.
so potent it made him think he could fly. He fell from a balcony, suffered horrific head injuries.
Ross listened to the story of some
who purchased
a party pack from Silk Road
containing a synthetic drug from China.
made it in an unregulated lab.
The kids had heard about the site, simply gone online,
Followed the guide about how to buy Bitcoin,
made an order on Silk Road,
and the items turned up in the mail
But
easy.
when one of the kids took it,
He started panicking,
he suddenly didn't know where he was or what he was doing. The room was spinning.
He got up and started
He had no
running,
idea where he was going,
and ran straight
off the hotel
Falling
balcony.
30
I would
feet
just
into the parking
absolutely
lot
love
below.
to
What
have
he
seen
turned
it.
out to be. No matter what your thoughts on Ross,
You've seen what can happen.
if your browsing isn't protected,
I think we can all agree.
we want to keep our personal information private and secure. And that's why I want to
About
tell
today's
video sponsor
Guardio
is a browser
that
extension
can keep you and your family safe online.
detect threats in real time before they cause harm,
Unblocks phishing links, malicious websites,
unwanted notifications,
sketchy extensions,
and many other types
as opposed
of
to
threats.
traditional antiviruses.
Cardio can actually skin sites
Before
and
you
files.
access or download anything
And since
harmful,
the browser is where we store payment
crypto
details,
wallets,
passwords, addresses, and more,
it's crucial to keep your
and
information
have real-time
secure.
protection and alerts.
Making Cardio the perfect way to protect your vulnerable
They already
info.
have over 1 million users worldwide.
and were recently even featured by
I've started
Google,
using it and added my family members,
which there's no extra charge.
and it took control of my
And
online
I hope
safety.
it will help
if you
you
want
do
to
the
take
same.
control of your browsing
Today, use my
security,
link
Magnets
Cardio
Media, and get a limited time 50%
So
off.
that's
the first
only
month
$5 a
to
month.
keep 5 family members safe. This government was devoting more
To the
and
search
more
for
resources.
Dread Pirate Roberts.
But considering multiple different government
We're
agencies,
working on the case
like
of
the
Silk
FBI
Road
and the D, it might surprise you that the biggest breakthrough of all came from an IRS agent. Making a simple Google search, Gary Alford was a tax inspector who'd been assigned to the Silk Road
to
case
try
and track some of the money being laundered. However, he
Tor
had
or
pretty
anything
much
else
no
to do with
knowledge
Silk
of
Road.
What Gary did have in his
was
favor
that
he was very detail-oriented, and he read everything
to
3
make sure
times.
he never missed anything.
Gary also liked to think outside the box. His favorite ever criminal case was how they caught the serial
Who
killer
went
son
on a
of Sam
killing spree in New
in the
York.
70s. For a while, no matter how many detectives they put on the
Nobody
case,
could figure
but then
out
one
who the
day,
killer was.
an officer decided to take
and
a
look for
different
cars
approach
in
that
the
had
nearby
received
area
around the
parking
same
tickets.
time of the murders. The logic being that the murderer would hardly be concerned about running back to top up the parking meter whilst in the middle of killing someone. They found a pattern where the same car had received parking tickets on the night of the murders and always located fairly close to the scene of the crime. They then traced the owner of the car, and that led them straight to the murderer.
Who confessed.
Gary liked this case because it proved you could
People
outperform by
more
looking at the
and
problems
Gary was
differently.
convinced
Must
the
have
founder
left
of
a
Silk
similarly
Road
small mistake
behind
the digital equivalent.
Gary
of the
started
parking
what
search
search
by
by
earliest
asking
post about Silk Road
on the
internet, since they figured whoever started
would have
the
had
site
to
draw up interest.
So
in the
Gary
first
went to
place.
Google,
Typed the Silk Road
and
web
using
address
advanced
into
search,
the search box.
he filtered by date,
Looking for results only from
which is
early
when the Silk
2011
Road
only a
was
few
rumored to
search
have
results
started.
came up,
and one of them was
from a user called
on a
Altoid
forum called the Shroomery.
The post sounded more like
Not
a
the
user
creator
of the site, but it was the first record
of someone
online,
mentioning
so Gary
Silk Road
searched for other posts by a user called Altoid
and
from
stumbled
around the same
across
day
called
post on
Bitcoin
another
Talk,
forum, where someone with the same Altoid username had posted.
Has anyone
It's
seen
kind
Silk
of like
Road
an
yet?
anonymous
Barry thought it
Amazon
was
com.
interesting that the first mentions of Silk
were
Road
both
online
coming from this same username,
and this person
multiple
had been
different
promoting
forums.
Silk Road on
Right around the time that Silk Road
Gary
launched,
looked
so
through Altoid's post history
and
on
a
the
few
forum.
months after
Altoid
Silk
made
Road
another
started,
post
a pro
saying
needed for a Bitcoin
it was a job
for
ad.
Bitcoin-related projects. But inside the post read, if interested, please send your answers
To Ross
the following
Gmail.com
questions.
now.
When Gary told his colleagues
They
about
dismissed
these
them.
findings, they said just because this user
was the first one to
didn't mean
publicly
he was
post
the
about
creator,
Silk
which is
Road.
true. They certainly needed more
the more
evidence
Gary
to
looked
prove
into
any
any
Albrecht
Ross,
character, the more convinced he became that this was the guy behind Silk Road. First, by searching the name Ross Ulbricht, Gary found Ross's YouTube
containing
channel videos about libertarianism,
along with the saved
about
video
how to get away with stealing.
But also Ross had used the username.
Oh yeah, Ross, which was interesting, because
Or
whenever
wrote on the
Dread
Silk
Pirate
Roberts
Roberts
yeah,
messaged
not
anyone,
yes or yeah,
always just yeah. It was a small
but
detail,
perhaps
more than
Secondly,
just a
Gary
coincidence,
found
which had
Ross's LinkedIn
anti-government
Ross
posts.
had written,
The most widespread and systematic
use of force
is amongst
and
institutions. So this is my current point
The
of
best way
efforts,
to change
is
the
to change the
government.
minds
To that
of the
end,
governed. I'm creating
give
an
people a
economic
what it would
and
be
without
like
the
to live in a world.
use of force. Thirdly, they found a coding question related to Tor
posted on Stack
which had been
Overflow.
posted by a user called Ross.
But within a
Albrecht.
minute
He
of
changed his
clearly
username
he
real
slipped up by
and
using
so
his
that's
real
why
name.
he changed
Right away.
Gary couldn't shake the feeling that this
So
was
Gary
the guy
asked
they
to
were
work
calling
for the
to
Department
do
of
a search,
Homeland
and they
on
found a
Ross
recent
Albrecht's
on his
name.
file where he'd ordered
Fake IDs
that had been
online.
intercepted.
When Ross
he
had
made a
been
comment
questioned
that
by an officer
anyone
about
could go
this.
on a website called
And so why
Silk
Ross
Road.
said that.
Is anyone's
Maybe
guess
he was trying to
that
make
buying
the point
fake wasn't
ideas.
that big of a deal,
Or
these
maybe he
days.
just
That
got
Silk Road
overconfident.
either way.
Never be
Gary
traced
felt
to
this
him.
whole
Now, of
thing was
course,
suspicious.
all these different
still weren't
details.
conclusive evidence.
Ross Ulbricht was
and
the
owner of
creator.
Silk
But
Road.
here's the thing.
Other important details about the
Hadn't
case.
been
To
shared
be
with
honest,
Gary.
nobody expected
This IRS agent
would crack the case that
had
other
been working
agencies for over 2
so
years.
they hadn't
bothered to fill
Recent
him in.
developments.
While Gary had been doing this
The
research
FBI had
of
managed
the
to
server
find out the IP
Silk
address
Road was
using that
hosted
IP
on.
address.
They'd managed to find
server
out
was
in a data
hosted
center
and by
in
working
Iceland.
with the Icelandic
authorities,
the FBI were able
to infiltrate the Silk Road server. Now, as for
how
exactly
the government
the
found
server's IP address in the first place,
that's a bit of a controversial
some
issue.
believe the NSA
Had some involvement.
and used an illegal spying tactic that would have infringed on Ross's Fourth Amendment rights. However, the government denied this and said the way they were able to get access to the server was because of vulnerabilities in Silk Road's code, which leaked the server's IP address. This is definitely possible because, as we've already established, Silk Road's code had plenty of problems because of how quickly it had been developed. By Ross could initially been working on it all by himself. Either way, now that the FBI had tracked down the Silk Road server in Iceland, they could access a lot of crucial data. Most importantly of all, they could see activity on the server, like whenever the Silk Road admin logged in or out. The logs showed the most recent admin login had come from an
In
internet
San
cafe.
Francisco.
Whilst this was a major breakthrough, the FBI still didn't have any leads on who the hell Dread Pirate Roberts actually was. And that's when they got a call from Gary at the IRS. Gary got on a call with agents from other departments working on the case, like the DA and FBI. And he laid out everything he'd found. Gary explained that this person, with the username Altoid, had been the first one to mention Silk Road online, and he'd made multiple posts about Silk Road on different forums, almost like he was